is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The World Today, live from CGTN in London. I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. A tight race ends. The polls are now closed in Germany's elections as the country votes on who will run Europe's largest economy. Long queues and closed pumps. Britain's Transport Secretary calls for calm as fuel shortage fears spark panic buying at petrol stations. And washed up. Thousands of dead fish on the banks of the Tiber spark a political blame game in Italy. The polls are closed and counting is about to get underway following a tight contest in the German election. Voters have been deciding who will succeed Angela Merkel as Chancellor. She's been in charge of Europe's biggest economy for 16 years. Final opinion polls gave the centre-left Social Democrats candidate Olaf Scholz a narrow lead. But the Conservative CDU's Armin Laschet reduced the gap in the final stages of the campaign. And the numbers showed Green candidate Annalena Baerbock coming third. But the vote has been too close to call, and an outright winner is unlikely. Let's talk to Ryan Thompson, who's in Berlin for us. Ryan, to be clear, we're not going to find out who's going to be the next Chancellor yet, are we?
That's correct, Juliet. It will be a very, very close race. And I have to say, just in the last second, we've gotten some of the exit polling data in, at least these initial exit polls. It is an incredibly tight race. It looks like the CDU and the SPD are coming in with both 25% of the vote share. The Greens far behind them at 15%, but it looks like we are going to be watching quite closely tonight as the CDU and the SPD go neck and neck to see who has the largest share of votes and who will be able to put the next Chancellor candidate forward. You mentioned we won't have a new Chancellor in the hot seat just yet. That is correct. That is because we will see for many weeks and months as the parties begin to form a coalition, form the next government. They'll have to work out a common platform. Last time we had elections in 2017, the Grand Coalition, which is the SPD and CDU, it took them 6 months to agree on a whole new platform to keep going, even though they had been working together for years. In the meantime, it will be Chancellor Merkel who will stay on in a caretaker capacity, but we don't expect her to adapt any new laws or really drive a CDU platform that she hasn't stood for previously.
So exit polls showing a two-way tie between the SDP and the CDU with 25% each. The Greens pulling up third, 15%. Ryan, what have been the main election issues?
Well, interestingly, at the beginning of this campaign, it looked like the Greens would actually see much more support because of the issue of climate change. It's a huge conundrum in Germany as it looks to end nuclear power in about a year's time, and then by 2038 phase out coal power entirely, which has powered the country since long before reunification. There's also questions about how the business transition will go on, because, of course, Germany is an auto capital, right? It's home to some of the world's most powerful automakers, but they are now moving away from internal combustion engines, those gas guzzlers, and towards electric vehicles, so they'll have to fall in line with German standards and EU climate standards. So there's a lot of questions here on the climate question. Unfortunately, it looks like the support for the Green Party did not resonate as strong enough to really see this issue being taken up by the voters. Of course, on top of that, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, the handling of that. Angela Merkel has gotten good marks, but there's still a way to go before we can fully exit this pandemic. It's important to keep the economy alive, to make sure that important business schemes are in place. And then we also have questions about booster shots and what comes next with forward variants, et cetera, et cetera. Lastly, it can't be said without an important mark here that this is Europe's largest economy. The economy is a powerhouse in Germany, from the auto industries to chemical factories to software and technology firms. This GDP is key for the European GDP, and so it's important that these businesses are satisfied with the result and that they keep an eye on some of what these results will mean for them in the future as we move forward.
The climate, COVID and the economy. Ryan Thompson in Berlin, thank you for the update. So how are Germans approaching this election? The first since 1949, with no incumbent seeking another term. Natalie Carney has been speaking to voters in Munich.
More than 60 million Germans are eligible to cast their votes at 88,000 polling stations across the country. And this polling station in Munich, set up at a local elementary school, has seen a steady flow of voters of all ages since they opened at 8 a.m. For many, it's a very important day.
Yeah, I think so, definitely.
Why?
Because we had 16 years the same chancellor, and now it's like the cards are new on the table and everybody can, maybe make a change.
Sehr, sehr wichtig.
They are very, very important. Well, every election is very important. All of my life I have voted. But now it is that we could lose our positive position in Europe and the world. And this is what I'm afraid of.
Welt verlieren.
Angela Merkel has been the second longest standing chancellor in the country, but the first to leave the top job at the time of her choosing. Her successor, Armin Laschet, has been trailing in opinion polls to the Social Democrats' Olaf Scholz. However, that margin of difference has decreased in the days leading up to today. Polls indicate a close race.
Germans are being asked for two votes, one for a candidate in their constituency and another for a party. The winners will then make up the 598-seat German Bundestag. If no one party claims a majority, then a coalition must be formed. Once the new government has then been decided, it will be them that vote for the next chancellor, who too must win an absolute majority.
While voters do not choose the chancellor, preference of candidates plays a role for undecided voters, which makes up as much as 40% of the electorate.
Well, obviously there will be a new chancellor, but there will be a new coalition. There are many issues, and of course each of the possible partners in the coalition will bring their own view in.
According to recent polls, the most likely coalition is one between the conservative CDU-CSU alliance, the center-left SPD, and the Greens, or the pro-free market FDP in an awkward three-way team. However, if history is anything to go by, it could take months to form the next government. After the federal elections in 2017, it took 6 months of negotiations between the parties before the CDU and SPD agreed to another grand coalition. So, it could be a while still before Merkel gives her final wave goodbye. Natalie Carney, CGTN, Munich.
Well, let's talk about the exit polls. And a quick reminder, so far we're seeing a two-way tie between CDU, CSU and the SDP, polling 25% each. The Greens, 15%. Well, joining us now is Dominic Zylum. He's a professor of governance, conflict and security at the University of Reading. So thanks ever so much for taking the time, sir. Look, based on the initial exit polls, is any party going to get anything near a clear majority?
No, clearly not. And I think it will be the CDU which will be most disappointed with the outcome. They were far ahead in the polls several months ago. There were talks about the SPD scoring 10 to 15%, which was really pulled out by what looked like a strong campaign by its candidate for the chancellorship, Olaf Scholz. So the CDU will be most disappointed, and it's likely to open up some of the divisions within the party that were quite visible ahead of the choice of the candidate for the chancellorship, and that I think will make the coalition building more complicated, because there are various interests within the party.
You've already said it's complicated. If we're still looking at maybe a three-way coalition, will anything get done?
So I don't think a three-way coalition will be less effective than a two-way coalition necessarily, and that's because the whole German system is very much focused on consensus building through its two-chamber system, the distribution of power across the different Länder. So I don't think that a three-party coalition would be a lame duck just because of the number of parties. And the differences across three parties is not necessarily greater than across two, in particular, both within the SPD and within the CDU-CSU. They're quite diverse constituencies. There is an argument, I think a two-party coalition is quite unlikely. It's worth remembering that, as you mentioned earlier, it took 6 months last time to form a new grand coalition between CDU, CSU and the SPD. It was the SPD that didn't really want that coalition, because they feared they would lose and lose and lose and would be almost swallowed up in terms of their program by Merkel and the CDU, who very effectively kind of occupied much of the political space there in the past. So I think there might be some reluctance from both parties, but especially the SPD, to go into a two-party coalition.
So to get anything done might take an awfully long time and a lot of negotiation. Look, there's a lot of talk about Merkel's legacy. She's known very much as a chancellor who can manage crises, but doesn't necessarily solve them. So what kind of a toll would you say that's taken on Germany?
So I think there are three big crises that she responded to and that are now very much shaping the political landscape. The first one was the Fukushima disaster and the decision to exit nuclear power and to have what the Germans call the Energiewende, so to move to renewable energies. And many of these issues are clearly very much at the forefront of the campaign because of the significant infrastructure requirements, the significant changes in behavior, the implications for industry, etc. I think the second one is, of course, the migration crisis, and then the third one has been the financial crisis in 2011 and the impact of this on European integration. I think in many ways Merkel has tried to solve some of these, or certainly advanced them, but there were all of them are large, complex problems, and many of the issues remain unresolved. And to some extent, her dominant personality might have meant that a full debate around some of them hasn't necessarily happened.
Hasn't happened yet. Well, Dominic Sahum in Reading, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The candidates have been crossing the country to make their final campaign pitches to undecided voters. The election is being seen as a watershed moment for Germany's post-Merkel era. But as Trent Murray reports from Berlin, it may take some time for Germany to adjust to a new leader.
After more than a decade and a half in power, Angela Merkel has decided to call it a day. The 67-year-old German Chancellor's decision to retire has left a fresh field of new candidates hoping to succeed her. But as Germany's 60.4 million eligible voters prepare to elect a new government, many are also reflecting on the legacy of Germany's first woman Chancellor, who leaves office with high approval ratings.
16 years is a long time, but it's enough. It's good, and it's good for a new time, for new things and new politics.
I'm a little bit sad that she is going now, and she was a great, fine lady.
It's a pity. She's been great for all of Europe and Germany for a long time, and we will definitely miss her very much.
Her leadership at home has been characterised by a calm and cautious approach to governing, avoiding populist platforms and personality-driven politics. That strategy has helped Merkel, a trained quantum chemist, win 4 back-to-back elections. Her signature triangle of power becoming a symbol of stability for many voters. But she has also faced challenges, including internationally. The 2008 Greek debt crisis saw her spearhead Europe's tough implementation of austerity measures, making her a poster woman for the north-south divide that often plagues EU politics. The 2015 migrant crisis became a flashpoint in Merkel's leadership, driven by memories from her time behind the Iron Curtain in communist East Germany. She decided to welcome refugees fleeing the Syrian war.
Let me simply say that Germany is a strong country, and our intention must be to say, we have achieved so much, we will manage this. We can manage this, and where there is an obstacle, we have to overcome it.
That decision proved controversial and helped see the anti-immigrant AfD party win seats at the 2017 election. The first time the far-right party has managed to enter parliament in modern Germany's history. And while Merkel may have hoped for a quiet final few years in office finessing her legacy, fate would have other plans, with the outgoing leader charged with leading Germany through the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's serious. Take it seriously. Not since German unity, no, not since World War II has there been a challenge to our country where it depends so much on our acting together in solidarity.
In her 16 years, Merkel has worked with 4 US presidents, 4 French presidents and 5 British prime ministers. That long tenure means whoever wins this coming election will have to work hard to step out of her shadow, but also prioritise tackling issues that some critics say were neglected during her 4 terms in office. 31 years after reunification, economic inequality remains a persistent problem in eastern Germany, formerly the Soviet-allied GDR. It's an issue that some experts say wasn't properly addressed by successive Merkel governments.
I see the danger that Germany is drifting further and further apart. If you look at many issues, if you see how people in the East consider the approach to fighting against the pandemic, if you see what people in the East consider to be the most important political issues that need to be resolved, and if you compare that to the West, in the East, for example, environmental issues are not as seen as crucial as in the West. So we actually have 2 Germanys more and more, and we've had them for a long time. And this is quite disappointing after such a long time of actually legally being one country.
Whoever replaces Merkel, their decisions will have far-reaching consequences both at home and abroad, including Europe's relationships with China, Russia and the United States. And as Europe's biggest economy, what happens here matters to households and businesses right around the world. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
Switzerland looks set to allow same-sex marriage after a nationwide referendum to decide on opening civil marriage and the right to adopt children to gay couples. Projections include more than 60% of voters favour the proposal. The amended law would also allow lesbian couples to have children through sperm donation, which is currently only legal for married heterosexual couples. The airport on Spain's Canary Island off La Palma has reopened after a 24-hour closure. However, flights remain cancelled due to ash coming from the volcano. Experts say there are currently 2 active lava flows as eruptions intensify a week after the volcanic activity began. Buildings and roads have been destroyed by the lava flow, with more than 6,000 people forced to evacuate. Still ahead here on The World Today. There's no shortage of fuel. That's the message from the British government, but drivers are not convinced.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
Welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Counting is underway in the German elections, with exit polls showing the 2 major parties, the CDU-CSU alliance and the SPD, tied in a dead heat, with 25% of the vote. And long queues and closed pumps. Britain's Transport Secretary calls for calm as fuel shortage fears spark panic buying. Britain's Transport Minister has urged motorists to behave normally and not rush to refill their cars, insisting there's no shortage of fuel in the UK. It comes as long queues have formed at petrol stations amid reports of shortages, rationing and station closures. Meanwhile, the UK government is to issue short-term visas for truck drivers to fix supply problems of not only fuel, but food and goods in the run-up to Christmas. Let's get more on this with Michael Voss. Michael, all weekend I've noticed that the roads snarled up around local petrol stations and also all around the studios here. What have you noticed out and about?
I mean, it is, and every day there are more and more either closures or long queues at petrol stations. The phrase we've been hearing about recently is supply chain problems, which in terms of petrol is all about the shortage of lorry drivers. And the Road Hauliers Association has long said that there's about 100,000 drivers missing at the moment. They're short of that sort of number. For several weeks and months now, we've seen some of the effects of that. In supermarkets, you see things disappearing from shelves, and then restaurants like Nando's and Kentucky Fried Chicken have had to close some outlets because they couldn't get their chicken supplies. But it's the shortage of fuel which is really hitting home. The acute shortage of lorry drivers has been known about for months, but it's taken panic buying and long queues at petrol stations to force the government into an embarrassing U-turn. The UK will offer 5,000 temporary visas for foreign lorry drivers, reversing one of the key reasons for leaving the European Union, to reduce the dependency on cheaper foreign labour.
They're making exemptions to work permits and all that for lorry drivers. I mean, this was the whole point of Brexit. I mean, the whole Brexit is now under question, isn't it?
It's a bit like pasta and toilet roll in COVID, isn't it? All over again, but now with fuel.
Despite the long lines, the government insists there is no fuel shortage and is urging people to stop panic buying.
There's plenty of fuel. There's no shortage of the fuel within the country. So the most important thing is actually that if people carry on as they normally would and fill up their cars when they normally would, then you won't have queues and you won't have shortages at the pump either.
As well as issuing visas, the government is also taking measures to reduce the training time needed to get a lorry driver's licence and writing to retired drivers asking them to return to work. But the opposition says it's all too little, too late.
This is a complete lack of planning. You know, we exited the EU. One consequence was there was going to be a shortage of HGV drivers. That was predictable.
The haulage industry isn't the only one with a serious labour shortage, and the government could now face pressure to ease immigration restrictions for the health service, care homes, hospitality and the farming sectors. The poultry industry will also be able to hire 5,500 foreign workers on 3-month visas in a bid to ensure there's no shortage of turkeys, Britain's traditional Christmas meal. The government says that immigration is a short-term fix and that it's up to industries to pay more to attract local hires. Many fruit and vegetable farmers, though, say very few local people are applying for such physically intensive jobs, and the National Farmers Union is calling for 12-month COVID recovery work permits. The lorry driver shortages have also resulted in growing gaps on supermarket shelves. None of the measures announced are likely to provide immediate fixes. An end to panic buying at the pumps may help ease tensions, but the country faces a difficult run-up to Christmas.
Michael, we heard the Transport Secretary there saying that people should act normally, but are motorists listening?
No, they're not.
No.
And when you know one queue starts, you see pictures of a forecourt closing and everyone goes, I must fill my car up. I have to say, talking to people in line waiting to fill their cars up today, there is a lot of frustration. I mean, Brexit isn't the only problem with the lorry drivers. There's COVID, there's poor conditions and poor pay. So there are a variety of reasons. But I think there's also frustration. I was certainly shouted at by a few people saying, you press, you're making this problem worse because we're reporting it. But I think there is growing frustration. And in the coming months, I mean, not just the fuel shortage, you're going to get inflation, you're going to get rising gas prices, all sorts of other problems. And I think in the longer term, this could turn into a political problem for the government.
Well, Michael Voss, I'm sorry you were shouted at by people berating you, panic buying themselves. Anyway, Michael Voss, thank you very much. Environmental groups are calling for urgent action to clean up Italy's river Tiber after thousands of fish were found washed up on the riverbanks. Experts say that while the political blame game continues, the river's biodiversity is increasingly at risk. Hermione Kitson has the story.
The Tiber is the longest river in central Italy, dividing Rome in two. It also demonstrates the two sides of the capital, the divine and the degraded. Giulio Bandandi has worked on the river for 40 years and says it's a sad story of neglect.
It has been dormant all those years. They haven't done anything. It is abandoned.
Mario Messina opened a restaurant here 12 years ago and says it's a bittersweet location to do business.
It is difficult with the floods, but also with the pollution. Often bulky waste items like fridges pass by, and it's not nice for all the people who are dining here.
Consequently, many animals that call the river home are struggling to survive. This month, thousands of fish were found washed up on the riverbanks and in the coastal town of Fiumicino. It raised fresh concerns about chemical dumps and pollution from illegal dwellings.
But in a statement, the Regional Agency for Environmental Protection says the river is constantly monitored and that there hasn't been any deterioration of the water quality.
The agency says the fish died after a downpour of heavy rain which swept waste into the water and momentarily restricted oxygen. Experts believe it could risk the biodiversity of a delicate ecosystem.
It is full of fish and crustaceans and birds such as grey herons, magpies and knights of Italy. The river is full of life.
Environmental groups say there are too many bureaucratic roadblocks.
We have too many entities involved in the river. We want just one that can make decisions without the need of a roundtable discussion involving different political interests.
They say action is needed now to preserve the eternal city's ethereal beauty.
Despite all of its difficulties, the river is an oasis full of history, but it needs to be appreciated to be preserved.
Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Rome.
And our main story again. Counting is underway in the German elections, with exit polls showing the two major parties, the CDU-CSU alliance and the SPD, tied in a dead heat with 25% of the vote. It comes as Angela Merkel steps down after 16 years in charge of Europe's biggest economy. Well, that's it for The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're available on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. We're on YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. From all the team here in London, goodbye.